Good morning and welcome to what you need to know about the carbon market. My name is David Voss. I'm a producer in Northeastern Nevada, and I'm here because I have my own questions about the carbon market, and we want to keep today simple. What we're after today is to find out what you need to know before you enter a contract, how you enter a contract, the long-term benefits and possible cons to it. Like I said, today is a very low-level version of what the carbon market looks like. I know when I talk to other producers or people in finance, when I start to learn more about the carbon market, I'm more confused than when I started. I hear people say that this is a passing fancy. I hear people say this is the future of ranching. As a producer, if there's a way for me to get paid for my good stewardship, I want to know about it, and not as a subsidy, but if there's a genuine market for the good things we're doing out on the ground, we should take advantage of it and get paid for it.
In terms of his background, I've had an interesting opportunity to work in the research side of this and conduct some soil carbon research. Certainly, there's many scientists in this room that are well more accomplished than I am in the space. But I've had the opportunity to kind of work within this nexus of the research of the science, but also working with the View Carbon project aggregators. To develop a structure and framework for how to market my work, but then also most importantly working with a number of producers that are interested in working in the space, primarily in the Southern Great Plains. And so I'm like you. There's this old saying that the more you know you don't. And I think we've all got more questions now than we probably did when we started. But I'm pretty passionate about making sure that the science is supporting these markets. I think there's a tremendous amount of excitement around them. But I think we need to bolster this we have to bolster it with reality. And the reality is that we live in a very complex and work in a very complex natural system that's dynamic and it changes over time. These markets are structured to work in a linear plane, and carbon doesn't too much for that way. And so I also think that I don't want us to get overly myopic in thinking about carbon as the solution to save ranches. We have to look at that as one ecosystem service that these ranches are providing, and it's part of a bigger suite of ecosystem services that producers are part of that solution to help us get further down the road. But I'm the elephant in the room today, so let's talk about it.
My name is Jenny Plumhar. I'm also from Texas, like Jeff. I manage 3 ranches in the Texas Panhandle, and I am executive director of the Texas Grazing Coalition. So I kind of have a dual role here in the carbon thing. The owner of those ranches in the Panhandle signed a contract last year on some of his own property in the Wichita Falls area. And that proved to be a very expensive mistake for us. We're still recovering from. Learned a lot about the contracts at that point in time. With Texas Grazing Land Coalition, we're doing our best to get information out to producers about contracts. Jeff and I were both part of a group with Texas Ag Land Trust and several others that put together a publication that I think is arriving here during this session on Carbon 101, questions you should ask. We had legal advice on that, and just things to ask before you get involved in these contracts. So I've probably had a unique experience with these contracts, but I fully support what Jeff is saying. The science has got to support what we're doing. And there's a lot of unknown. There's models that are used, but you have to remember those are models. And there's just a lot of unknown around this, and you need to tread very carefully.
Yeah, I'm Peter Donovan. Good morning. And I'm with a nonprofit organization called the Stewardship. And a little bit of background, I spent a lot of my younger years herding livestock, sheep and cattle in the sheep business for a while. I did a lot of range land monitoring. And around 2009, 2010, about the time that the Chicago Climate Exchange plan collapsed in my belly up, I started doing a lot of carbon measurement, and I did hundreds of carbon measurements in ranches all across North America over the space of about 10 years. And what I found was that carbon accrual was noisy, highly variable, very vulnerable to dry conditions. I had some carbon measurements that I did that went way up in the first few years and then went back down again in 10 to 11 years, partly because I'm attributing that to dry conditions. And I was interested in the use value of soil carbon. And there's a difference between use value and exchange value. Use value of a 100-pound sack of wheat is if you can eat it, make bread out of it, or plant it. The exchange value is what you can sell that for on the market. And there's sometimes quite a difference. And I noticed that people, as I went around the country sampling carbon, I noticed a lot of people were interested in the exchange value. But our myopic focus, as Jeff pointed out, we sometimes forget about the ocean when we're talking about movements of carbon through the atmosphere and biosphere. There's a whole lot of carbon, dissolved carbon dioxide in the ocean, probably more than there is carbon in the atmosphere and soils combined. And it's a well-known fact of physical chemistry that you can dissolve carbon into a liquid by increasing the pressure of carbon dioxide above it. That's how we carbonate beverages. We pump CO2 into the air above it. And that carbonates the beverage. If you leave it open on a counter, especially a warm counter, that carbon dioxide will outgas off the liquid. And what this tells me, and it's not very well known for some reason, is that if we're able to take a significant amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it in rocks, trees, or soil, the ocean's going to release a nearly equivalent amount. And what this makes of carbon is it makes it into a shell. Is it carbon in the land? Is it in the air? Is it in the sea? And it's based on exchange value. And this exchange value is subject to public opinion. And there's many people now that have a distinct skepticism about the values of offsets as an accounting trick, if you will. Does it really take carbon out of the atmosphere? Does it really reduce emissions? This is not to say that there isn't an incredible use value with soil carbon, but you can't transfer that use value. The use value is in water, in allowing the soil to accept and hold water, wildlife, and of course, productivity. You can't sell that use value without the state wanting to. It's important to people downstream and downwind, but that use value is with the land. And I don't criticize ranchers for seeking another source of investment. We need investment in better management. But the market as a whole is a shell game. And you can't hide from that as a rancher. You have tremendous liabilities in terms of price, risk, public opinion, greenwashing, increase in surveillance monitoring. You have benefits, yes, you get investment, but you also have tremendous risks.
Thanks, Peter. I should have said early on, this panel is broken in, this discussion is broken into two groups. Following this group, after 1 hour, we're going to have carbon aggregators to talk more specific contract stuff. So don't hold back any questions, but do realize we're going to have more specifics coming up after this.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Connie French, and I'm from Malta, Montana. My husband and I ranch south of Malta, predominantly from Africa, also in yearlings. I am a member of the RSA group. I'm on board of directors. I am a trustee for the Montana chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and I'm an administrator for the Health Conservation District. So I'm pretty involved in the conservation world. And we started in on looking into these carbon markets and explored them. And then the more that we explored the carbon markets, the more confused we got and the more mixed messages we got from very intelligent, knowledgeable, well-respected people had a lot of varying opinions on it. And so that caused us to back off. So I'm actually here to learn as much as the rest of you are about carbon markets, because there's so much to know. And that's one of the reasons I think that we backed off is we, as ranchers, don't have the time to invest in the research and the due diligence that's required to make a wise decision on whether or not to enter this carbon market. So we're depending on other people to do that for us and where to put our trust. Another issue that my husband in particular has with the carbon markets is there's an ethical component to that as well. And we talk about that, and it's kind of a touchy-feely, fuzzy kind of a thing, but it concerns us. So that's where we're at. We do have we're involved in a lot of other programs with a lot of other groups to bring extra money into the ranch and to help us with our stewardship and our infrastructure and doing a good job of grazing. So we're familiar with working with other groups, but this one just seems pretty complex and a little bit scary for us. So anyway, we're looking into things and have some questions just like everybody else.
But what I'm on this panel for, and I could go on about the monitoring protocols for a long time because that's what I do. I like to be, on my hands and knees, clipping plots and worrying about whether point intercept dot should be 2 millimeters or infinitely small. But that's a different thing. A lot of what I learned on the carbon market came from thinking about ecosystem services, which Greg, I was supposed to come after you, so like I'd know what you said instead of trying to guess what you're going to say, was introduced me to more than 25 years ago about non-commodity values and how to market those for ranches. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 25 years trying to market non-commodity things. What I'm on this panel for is the informal carbon market, which I've yet to do a formal carbon deal, despite a lot of clients trying to do them. But we do have some informal carbon deals going. And basically, I was supposed to come after Martin too, and he talked to me this morning about stewardship credits. But basically, the question of additionality is the people who have the most to offer, the people who've done the best job, who have the least additionality available. And last week I learned the term that conservation occurs at the speed of trust, and that the deals that we've done are occurring at the speed of trust because the buyers are frustrated by the amount of friction in the market and are trying to figure out a way to go directly to the producers to affect change on the ground without, and then with a amount of monitoring that made sense to producers. And in this case, the last case we did to a Catholic diocese in the Northeast, that they actually did not want, they had no interest whatsoever in the things that I talked about all day, science and everything. They want to see cool pictures and farmers having their lives changed and big changes in soil health. So that's what I'm here to answer questions about today.
Thanks, Jack.
Good morning. Thanks, Erica and Dave, for putting this together. I'm going to be another source of maybe misinformation, but anyhow, in the last 18 months, our company, Open Range Consulting, or myself, have gotten lots of calls, and we've gotten calls from people that we've never talked to. For instance, call from Bern, Switzerland, which is the reinsurance capital of the world. And this, I think they're a Jewish group, or I've been told that basically they were worried that they had actuarial tables for the last 500 years, and they have bonds, and they didn't know what the terms on the bond ought to be, length of time, interest rate, because they couldn't. The world's changed enough that from climate that they didn't know how to rate these bonds, and they were wondering if we could help. And I said, I can't. Large international banks, one of them, there are buyers out there. They started a climate fund for their bank, HSBC Bank, and they raised $2 billion in 9 months. There are people out there that want to do something about the climate, and the bank had special terms that were more than a decade and less than 10% that these buyers would be willing to lend money or something, and it could be on an individual basis. So instead of you, my fraternity, and people that have inspired that I normally have talked to most of my life, and the Nature Conservancy kind of guys and people that are trying to do things on the land that we've been around the burn barrel for years talking to, there's a whole different group that wants to talk to us. And so I've had a little bit of more exploration. I had friends 30 years ago get in on the CCX, a carbon exchange market. And I can tell you the reason it failed was a lack of metrics. When real money changes hands, there has to be trust, and there has to be known value. And eventually, and the CCX was based on the best and the brightest in soil science, thinking about how we're going to measure this. And then when it was not measurable, the wheels came off of that market. Anyhow, one of the people that I've lived by, a famous management consultant, Peter Drucker, said, how well you measure will determine how well you can manage and how well you market. So you have to be able to measure to make markets. And in our soil sampling, thousands of them, the thing that you'll learn is that if you just do soil sampling, the samples will be incredibly variable from your left foot where you're standing to your right foot, almost literally. So the other thing that we've learned, so for years, I'd say almost 30 years now, I've been trying to make a market for ranchers besides their cattle. But to make the market, you have to have a scale that is precise, accurate, timely, and cost-effective. Because the willing buyer of a value, say your cattle, and you, the willing seller, have to have a known value. So if you have a scale that only weighs in 500-pound increments, and you can't really certify very well, then the buyer, he goes, boy, I'd love to get this value from you, your cattle or your carb or these environmental values, but I'm not sure what I'm getting. So on that end of the trade, you go, I'm not sure what I'm getting now. There'd be lots of talk about it, and the guy's at the scale trying to make a deal with you. But if he doesn't know what, he's got to discount the price. Then on the other side of the scale, you're the seller, and you don't know what the amount is. And he offers a low price because he's worried he's got to make his money. Then basically you hear this low price and you say, I'm not in that market. I'm not going to do the trade. So what we've worked on is making the scale. What we found is that soil samples alone, the size of my fist or my arm, in a landscape of 1,000 acres or whatever, is just infinitesimally small as a way to infer what's going on. So Eric Sant, we've taken all these hundreds of samples and we've related them to new satellite imagery. And guess what? What's in the soil reflects off the ground. And we've made high correlations between what's in that soil for all kinds of attributes in the Haney test, all 31 of them. And we think that we might have, so soil sample alone, remote sensing alone is not enough. The other thing that we've done, because I've gotten farther and farther in the market, is that there are gold standards, matter of fact, for the methodology of how you're going to do it, how you're going to measure the land. And so Vera, which is an international certification process and the gold standard, when we have read those things that are assumed to be the right thing, they are basically lacking and they're going to kill the trust. And eventually that market, and there are big boys to play. I was just talking about the different trades that have happened with Microsoft and Google and stuff. And it's fine. And you can sell some things on a cosmetic basis if you're a rancher, but on a real legitimate basis of what's really going on with your carbon, and you go back and take a soil sample in about the same place, you're going to get totally different numbers, or big enough numbers that it'll erode the trust. So that's why we've been working. I'll say one, to give you an idea, we looked at 3 1-acre plots side by side in good grazing, bad grazing, and no grazing. And when we looked at the 600 soil samples over 3 years, the very same soil sites, there was no statistical difference between one or the other. There was a difference in the mean, but we were able to correlate these samples to spectral imagery, and we could make a relationship. So anyhow, I think there's all kinds of buyers. Of course, if we could get some more money as ranchers, we would make the trade. But until the metrics are good enough, the market is there, but it won't work without precision, accuracy, timeliness, and cost effectiveness of that scale. And I hope we can get her done. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jesse Brotz with Humboldt Ranch. We lease Humboldt Ranch from Nevada Gold Mines. They've been an amazing partner in helping us do what we're trying to do out there. And I think what we've been doing is demonstrating at scale across a large landscape that we can manage using primarily grazing to get these outcomes. Specifically to carbon, we're showing that we're getting a 1% increase in carbon in our riparians, in the potential riparian zone across everything. And that's just through management. I mean, we're trying to manage a ranch in a way that is changing landscapes both on the uplands and the riparians. And in doing so, I think that we're changing carbon. And like everybody up here, most people have said, it's extremely difficult to measure in a way that makes people comfortable and is reliable. in our instance, we're going to be managing the ranch the way that we're going to be managing the ranch. We're going to be getting change. And regardless of whether we're getting paid for it or not, but with what we're doing and the effort we put in, as a producer, I mean, the idea of some sort of compensation for doing interesting things or above and beyond, or so then how can we measure it? Like Jack said, okay, there's informal markets, and that is always interesting. And with what Greg and Open Range is working on with measuring it at that scale level, I mean, that's pretty much what we're working on at the Humboldt Ranch is what can we do? How can we keep demonstrating that through just managing grazing in a certain way? How can we change the landscapes and then also figure out, working with Open Range, how we can measure it at enough scale to be interesting?
Yeah, and then I'm Martin Townsend. Like I said earlier, I am with Rancher Stewardship Alliance, and Jack always makes fun of me for my title, but I'll give it a go. I am in a Pheasants Forever position where they pay me, but I work for RSA administering their conservation program, where I go out and I try to get money from all those NGOs that Jack mentioned out of Bozeman, that we pull together in a conservation committee. And that committee is made up of around 35 different partners and 40 plus different programs that might have something to offer to ranchers in our area. So I make the joke a lot that I'll spend anybody's money that'll let me. And that's my job, is to then go work with ranchers and find the levers that are available and see if we can pull them. So I work very, very broadly across a lot of different programs, and somebody called me a programs expert the other day and it kind of like hurt inside, but I work in a lot of generalities on programs. It's more, like I said, it's a lever and how do we pull it? So in my world, I'm less concerned with the specifics of how carbon works, because oftentimes details get in the way of action. I'm more concerned with what does the ranch need to do? What does the program offer? What problem does the ranch have that we're trying to solve? And is this the right lever to pull? So we work with a lot of different ranches that are using carbon mitigation as part of a strategy, along oftentimes with other programs, to meet goals that they're having. We have one ranch, it's giant, I think like 62 sections, and they're working with carbon mitigation and World Wildlife Fund and Nature Conservancy and NRCS and Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks and everyone else that they could find, just trying to pull together enough resources to achieve the projects they're trying to do. And maybe in another 10 years, they'll have their pipe project all the way done if they can ever actually buy all the stuff they need. And then we work with other ranches that have worked in different sectors of how carbon can impact conservation programs. We work with other ranches that have worked with Nature Conservancy and easements, and those easements contain carbon conversion avoidance credits, which is a whole different brand of how carbon can interplay into conservation programs. So there's so many things out there that can add to a ranch's goals and their values of how they want to create change through time. I think carbon mitigation is the strategy for that, as long as it's the right lever to pull. But what I wanted to hammer on today as a producer is the details that you do absolutely need to know is, what do you want out of whatever program you're going in, and what are you willing to risk for that? There is no such thing as a program that completely pays for anything. Even if the payment is great, it's still not paying for everything. There's some economic value in there that isn't coming all the way through. And what basically are you willing to bargain for based on what you have to do? And we're coming off of 2 years of drought. I'm seeing a lot of fairly emotional decisions on projects that ranches are doing that I'm a little terrified might never pay off. So trying to make sure that we're keeping in mind the challenges of what happens once you're in a contract is huge. But then when the details do start to matter, I think we've listed at least 6 different ways carbon impacts programs so far. You need to know enough about carbon to know when it sounds like a program is or isn't something you want or need to be a part of. As a rancher, you kind of need to hear when it sounds like that might be a lever you could pull. So just in the programs we work with, it's not like carbon is the front item. we make the joke a lot that everybody wants to live in a world where we have more grapes, and then we make a lot of programs that offer grape flavoring, and it's maybe not necessarily the same thing. So we have programs where we're providing seed to reseed non-profitable crop ground to grassland. That funding just by seed, but it's fundraised for on saying it has a benefit for soil carbon and global warming. So in the background somewhere, carbon is being talked about as the reason to do something. And it's everywhere. Every program that we deal with is starting to talk about we should have some way to show how our program is beneficial to our funders to offset carbon. So we've heard a lot of different science behind how that's measured, but a lot of funders are asking for it and a lot of mediators are trying to provide it. So it's best to try to find ways to understand it. And I helped put together this panel, and I thought I understood carbon at like a 50% level, and I think I'm down to about a 2 by the end of this. And on the drive here, I was listening to a podcast for what I thought was just going to be fun. And then all of a sudden we were talking about carbon, and I didn't realize how we got there. It was a wildlife podcast. And how many of you have heard of the Pleistocene Park? They are going to genetically engineer and reintroduce woolly mammoths in a park in Siberia. And the goal of it is that they'll, when they're shedding, go out and rub down trees, and with less surface area for solar energy to capture, the ice will melt slower and they'll release carbon dioxide at a slower rate. And they're fundraising that as a carbon offset. I went, all right, one more. Let's jot that one down. Yeah, so my wrap up is I just want people to be aware of what it takes to be in a contract, regardless of what's behind that contract. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Good morning. I'm Scott Warner, and I need to hand it to Erica and Dave. They put the lawyer last in line and made him speak last, right? So I'm from Lakeview, Oregon. I'm an attorney. I've been representing producers across East Oregon and Western Idaho for about 25 years. I'm also part of a small group that's launching a real estate brokerage that will specialize in ranches with an eye to these kind of issues. So they've asked me to speak about legal issues with carbon contracts and valuation issues. And then they limit me to 3 minutes. So floating around the room somewhere is a sheet, a single sheet. And I am going to try and limit this to 3 minutes. And so there are 4 points on this sheet. Number one is, what is your contractual exchange of promises on a carbon contract? So if you're going to sell a carbon contract and sell credits, what's your promise to the person that's buying it? That's what number one represents. And I think it's important that we keep that promise in perspective from a 10,000-foot view, because folks, you've got the attention of Wall Street with this. We're in an age of social investing. Goldman Sachs is looking at this. February, there was an article in Bloomberg about 2 weeks ago on carbon markets. So it's not just dealing with NRCS, it's not just dealing with FSA. Number two on this sheet just refers you to 2 very good articles that address the terms for these carbon sequestration agreements. Okay, won't have time to go over all that today, but these are real good articles and a really good starting point. Point number 3 relates to valuation. And if you have a good carbon agreement in place, it will only increase the value of your real estate if it can be assigned when you sell it. Okay. So you have to be able to transfer that contract with the real estate. Now, the corollary is, if you have a bad carbon contract of some nature, you need to know whether that contract's going to bind your real estate when you sell it, because it may reduce the value. A buyer may not want that. So those are big legal and valuation issues. Finally, point number 4, work with your attorney early on. I don't think this issue needs a specialist. Don't call me. Your regular business attorney can do the analysis on this. Work with them early on, and I think it'll facilitate the process. Also, work with your accountant early on. Some of the initial guidance we have from the IRS are that carbon credits are treated as intangible property, which you're going to get capital gain treatment on, but you may not want capital gain treatment because ordinary losses won't offset capital gains. Blah, 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 tax. Talk to your accountant early on. The structure of the carbon agreement will probably dictate how it's going to be taxed. So legal perspective, valuation, feel free to ask questions. Thank you.
The only reason I'm up here moderating is because I get the chance to ask my questions first, and I'm going to take that opportunity right now and bring this down to a super low level. Jeff, early on, you talked about carbon not being sequestered in a linear fashion and how that may not jive with the contracts. Can you bring carbon sequestration down to a super simple level and describe what you mean by that non-linear sequestration?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody, we would want things to happen in sort of this increasing fashion, and it just doesn't work that way in this complex dynamic world that we work in called rangelands. There's a number of drivers that impact soil carbon sequestration. I mean, and so the plant cover, the soil type, just texture alone is a significant driver in the ability for a landscape to sequester carbon. And so, I mean, ultimately, we're pulling CO2 out of the air through a plant. That carbon's then getting translated in a number of different pools in the soil. But the factors that impact that, there are abiotic and biotic factors that impact our rate of sequestration. Drought is a huge one, especially as you move west of the 100th meridian. The ability to sequester carbon is much less. It's not saying you can't. It's just not the same as if you were in a vertisol in Iowa. And so context is really important when we start thinking about our expectations on how much carbon we're going to sequester.
Yeah, I think I'd be a little closer to understanding. Take that. The floor is open to questions. We have, sounds like nearly 100 people online right now, which is more than I expected. So those of you online, feel free to drop your questions in. Also, let us know where you're watching from. That's always interesting. The question was to Jenny specifically, what made your contract unsuccessful, and what steps would you do differently next time? Sum it up.
Good question. We should have contacted an attorney right out of the gate before we signed the contract. The contract had a lot of legal problems with it. But the first thing was the person selling the contract. It was an ag aviation firm in Central Texas. They represented the company that was offering the contracts, and they were going around to everybody and saying, okay, if we spray weeds, it'll increase your soil carbon. And, of course, we're the ones that are going to spray your weeds. If we broadcast seed, it'll increase soil carbon. And this is easy. You're just going to get paid for what you're already doing. And most of the ranchers did not have enough scientific background in it to realize that if you're getting paid for additionality and you're not going to change what you're doing on the surface, your outcome is not going to be what you hoped for. So a lot of buyer beware there. My landowner is a very smart businessman, also a very trusting person. And the cowboy foreman who runs his 15,000 acres said, everybody's doing this. We need to do it. It's easy. It's just we're getting paid for our soil. We need to do this. So yeah, an attorney's the first place. I would have one disagreement though. There were some attorneys that looked at some of those contracts there. And because they didn't understand that if you don't change your surface management, you're not going to get that additionality. So they needed a little scientific knowledge in there, or they needed to work with a scientist somewhere. But my landowner also made a very critical mistake. That ag aviation firm said, we'd like to order chemical to spray your weeds, and we need the money up front to order the chemical. And I'm still trying to get $247,500 back.
we talked about getting an attorney involved right away, getting your accountant involved right away. What about from that science side of things? Would you like to have, looking back, would you have liked to reach out to somebody from the science community to be on your team?
Well, he
I
was
saw Jack
lucky.
jump
He
up.
had me. He was lucky that he had me, but he didn't confess to signing that contract for a few months. Yes, you need to understand the science. I'm very concerned that ranchers don't understand the basic science of carbon sequestration in the soil and what causes more of it. And that it's a different what you do on the surface. Like Jeff said, context matters, but they don't understand all the management. There's a gate sign that a soil and water conservation district sells in Texas, and I love it. And it says, leave more leaves to grow more roots to grow more leaves. And I'd like to add one more line on there, to save more carbon or store more carbon. So as ranchers, we need to be very confident in understanding some of the basic processes that go on in our soils. And so Texas GLC has tried to have a role in some of that very, very basic education.
Thank you. Jack, what kind of credentials would you suggest that a science professional helping out the rancher needs to be useful in this process?
I'm always willing to be the pitch man for this. Obviously, the first call you need to make is to get your SRM certified professional range management or certified rangeland consultant.
Shameless promotion.
I have no problem shamelessly promoting SRM, and I will continue to do so for 6 months after they bury me.
I guess I'm directing my comment mostly to Connie. We've heard among most of you that there's a problem with the metrics and measuring the carbon aspects of it. I heard you say that you backed away for quite a few reasons. What might be some of the other reasons that caused you to, slow down from a trot to a walk, so to speak, and back away from?
So I'll try to keep this just brief, but there's several reasons. One of them was science, that we just didn't feel like there was a clear understanding of what the science was telling us. It wasn't cut and dried. It was the contract issue with the lawyer. We've had some experience with contracts gone bad, and we're pretty gun shy. So we don't want to get into that situation again. The ethics I mentioned, is this the right thing to do? And I think that Peter talked a little bit about that. And, do we want to sell our carbon offsets to companies that are not doing a good job? Do we want to just try to put a Band-Aid over something, or do we want those companies to be out there trying to do the right thing as well? That was one. And then time management. So we're involved in, like Martin was saying, we're one of those ranches that's involved in programs with World Wildlife Fund, with the Nature Conservancy, with Fish, Wildlife and Parks, with NRCS. That's a lot to manage on a day-to-day basis in the office at the ranch. And we just run out of time and energy to do that. And we knew that this was just one more program that we were going to have to spend a lot of time at to do it right. And rather than messing it up and getting into a bad situation, like Jenny was talking about, we just backed off. Does that answer your question, Lou? Okay.
I had similar questions about those ethics. Peter, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just very briefly, when you're trying to package a partially imaginary exchange value, the packaging gets very complicated, and it becomes almost another business to engage in.
I am a targeted grazer out in California and have both sheep and goats. So this is, I think my situation is a little bit unique. I'm wondering, because you mentioned about how this could potentially be adding value to your real estate if you become someone who has a carbon contract that could then be sold to the next landowner. We work on 80 to 90 different public and private lands throughout the year that providing a targeted grazing service. So I guess I'm asking, is this something that's going to follow the livestock and the grazing program, or is this something that's following the land? Would I be able to, as a targeted grazer, is this something that I could be doing and having certified on all these lands I work on, and I would be getting those credits, or does this go to the person who actually owns that land? And I know the public land versus private thing is its own, but I have no idea which of you would want to answer that.
Well, she's pointing at me. Opinion, I believe that the credit's tied to the land, not the management being applied to it. I mean, the management helps, it's a service to help sequester the carbon, right? You're sequestering the carbon into the soil, which is tied to the land. I could be wrong, but that's just my perception and take on it.
But why couldn't you offer the landowners the additional service of whatever it is you're offering them now, targeted grazing in terms of weed control or this, that, or the other? Why couldn't one of your additional services be, I'm going to help you improve your soil carbon, and you might get a slice of the financial part, but the contract would be with the land.
Those are some aspects I had not even thought about at all. So I feel like I know just a little bit less now.
So depending on your lease agreement, I think it might be possible for a lessee to sell carbon credits. I'm seeing working lands agreements, where a rancher is agreeing to set aside certain practices or development rights, not a full term conservation easement, but say a 20 or 40-year working lands agreement where those carbon credits are getting reserved, or half of them are getting reserved by whoever's paying for the working lands agreement. Okay. Typical working lands agreement I'm seeing says you'll continue to graze, but you'll do no more development. You maintain your water sources, you maintain your roads, you maintain your fences, but you won't do any more development, and you won't take anything out of native range. And I'm seeing those at 40 years. And in those agreements, I'm seeing we get half the carbon credits, you can keep half the credits type of thing. Again, I think this market is in its infancy, and I think so much is going to depend on the science. But I also don't think you can discount the interest, because it's certainly there.
How concerned are you all about carbon only be sampled in the top 20, 15, 20 centimeters, and not actually at the deep layers where, out here in the West, the majority of the roots are digging down, or even in the Great Plains, where you have the tall grass prairie where roots are going down, 3 feet, 6 feet, and we're missing all of that in those carbon accounts.
Yeah, the most variation in carbon that I've found in hundreds of measurements is in the layers. But I've also seen carbon losses, even under good management, in the 12 to 16 to 20-inch range. And I don't have any predictions. I think it's very difficult. But people say, well, my ranch has X% carbon. That's a meaningless statement, because to what sampling depth? And there's a lot of carbon that's down pretty deep. And the surface layers are particularly subject to microbial blooms, which can change fairly rapidly.
We started thinking about how we were going to measure ecosystem services about 30 years ago and been working on it. Anyhow, I was all about water, not carbon. Then a guy named Agoro came along, and he did great work. But carbon, we found in our sampling, is so highly dynamic, and we haven't been able to really afford going deep where it might be sequestered. And the verification in a lot of the literature by the people is like 8 inches or something would suffice to market. Whether that's true or not, I'm sure Peter knows a whole bunch more about that. But the other thing, this is a carbon talk, but in the people I've talked, like the world's largest ag lender, Rabobank, that we've been talking to, and HSB, they're all about bundling values. They actually see that water is the big deal, and their customers would entertain that. It doesn't have to be or diversity. And the last call I had last Friday, that Jesse's done a lot, but we can backcast, what's been the uplift if we can show it. And of course, with what Eric does with the remote sensing, we have a chance of showing what happened from the stuff we started 18 years ago anyhow. So the carbon alone is just problematic because people are working in Midwest and have multiple samples now because it's whatever, but it's variation, especially in the first foot or so, depending on whether it's a drought or not, or all kinds of things. It's just a highly dynamic element that's moving by temperature, by water, by biological activity. And so it's like using the standard for this environmental health based on, I'm not sure what the right analogy maybe like on something that's highly active and moving, and and any time and space that you're trying to move it, it's moving. And so that's, but spectrally, we might be able to follow that. So there's other more standard values, and the market is going towards those too, like water and water security and things like that are probably where we're going to end up at some point. And that's a lot easier thing to denote.
So I'm going to try and relay a question I had from one of the ranchers in Oregon recently. In terms of the conservation easements versus carbon sequestration, and how treatments like juniper control may almost be counterproductive, because one of the things is you want to store carbon, grow trees. That's one way of doing it. And for the land manager, the rancher, you want to remove juniper, you're losing carbon, right? Yes, you're going to build some through, but in the short run, you're going to lose tons of carbon. So what is the incentive for the rancher to keep the land productive, or just let it, bunch of juniper grow out there?
And what Greg said was about water is that in the last couple of weeks, the calls I've been getting on carbon have been, should we quit trying to measure market carbon and just go straight to measuring and marketing water? Because we know how much is in a gallon. But yes, and which leads to to get to your question is, does that make it simpler for, instead of having two counterproductive objectives of the way to sequester carbon is have more juniper, but the way to get to soil health and water and everything is to incorporate juniper control into your, does that sort of answer your question?
On the forward branch a bunch of years ago, what we did, because at our elevation and precipitation, you almost don't want to get rid of carbon because it took so many years to get there. So what we took a machine that just would masticate the tree in place to open up, to create the edges and increase the value for especially elk and stuff. And so you just went and all the carbon now, instead of standing in a lollipop, was laying on the ground. Well, you put that much litter on the ground, then we also, while running that, would put out some fertilizer so you could biologically ignite, breaking that stuff down. So there wasn't, that might be a case where you didn't lose the tree carbon. You actually made it less volatile to be lost to the atmosphere through fire. You got it on the ground so that now you can sequester water and change a much more dynamic and insulated situation where you have grasses and forbs, as opposed to this giant lollipop that can go up in the atmosphere in a fire like that. So that might be a case where you do both.
I think just kind of some thoughts and kind of what Connie was saying about managing programs and the things you're involved in. I mean, I think from the ranching standpoint, we look at it as it's just really hard to be involved in everything. If you open your doors to agency folks and help and markets, if you open them too wide, you get such a wave of help that it's too much to manage. And so prioritizing what you have, what's the biggest bang, what's the least risk for that rancher to do, you know? And then I always love, like, I really love, Greg always has these ideas that are like the third way. But that means talking the person into being able to do something that's not normal set ways to do things. So there almost always is a third way, but yeah, just getting out of that box of like, well, this is how we manage juniper. How do I sell to my whoever it is, the FSA agent or whatever, the NRCS agent, that I want to do it different and here's why, is kind of a hard sell. So sometimes that's the third way. We look at it a lot as we just really have to prioritize what markets, what programs we're going to get into, just so we can do a good job with what we have.
We have a lot of juniper too. And so to me, from it's an enterprise question. It's an economic question. And so you go back and let's just say carbon's trading for $25 a ton of CO2 equivalent, right? And in most cases where we're at, you're probably not going to sequester a ton, right? In a lot of the rangelands that we work in, you might be sequestering 2/10. So now you're getting paid $5 an acre for the carbon, not $25 a ton, an acre, right? Most people think, well, I'm going to sell a ton per acre. It's not, it's per ton of CO2 equivalents, right? And so if I'm only sequestering 0.2 tons per acre, I'm getting $5 an acre, not 25. And so compare that to what my grazable acre loss is to my ranch, my cow-calf enterprise, and I'm probably cutting the trees.
The methodology and how you remove that PJ could be pretty important. But that may not jive with the way your contract works. And that leads to this question from Tara on YouTube. The goal is to increase carbon over the contract period. However, if there is a decrease in estimated carbon, what are the consequences of these kinds of contracts? What would be the consequence of maybe doing a good practice, but it actually leading to less sequestration? And I'm just walking to the lawyer. Or should I not?
But that answer is really easy. It's going to depend. Who said it depends here before? It's going to depend on the terms of your agreement. And again, I think this is a developing market and in its infancy, and you're going to see changes in different contracts from different folks. So again, something to be aware of before you enter that contract. What happens if you can't perform? That's one of the reasons on my silly little handout at the first, I put what your promise is. Okay, as a producer, this is what you're promising to deliver. And again, the folks who are looking at this, it's not NRCS. It's not if you don't report, you're just not a part of the program next year. This is the Exxon Mobils are putting in their shareholder materials. We're doing this, relying on what the contracts you sign. So it's not just the same, the group of us dealing with each other.
Oh, sorry. Is there a viable way, instead of doing the measurements, the painstaking efforts of even going through desktop exercise, is there a way to use state and transition models to estimate, and maybe we're talking about less of a carbon market itself, but good stewardship should lead to better carbon sequestration? Is there something like that on the horizon where we can go to state and transition models for a quick estimate of what we'd be looking at carbon wise?
Maybe others have opinions that I think that's a great point. I mean, there's not even any soil health information in an ESD currently that needs to be worked on and added. But it is a framework. It's a framework from us to make assessments on rangelands or at least categorize sort of the state of the stewardship. I still think it's still going to be way too vague, in my opinion.
So a question on carbon longevity. So say a rancher is able to verify that so much carbon has been sequestered. The expectation is that it's going to be around a long time, 30, 40 years. And so, how much certainty is there that carbon is going to stay there that long, given changes in ownership, perhaps changes in management, changes in precipitation, changes in temperature, and there's a lot of uncertainty out there. So how does that play in?
I'll add fire to that list of changes.
you asked a combination of things. Some of that's how your contract's written. And how long you have to, like, let's say you get this, you achieve your goal, you store your carbon with your rangeland on some beautiful tall grass prairie, and the corn prices go through the ceiling, and you decide you're going to raise corn. Well, you probably can't change the practice on that land. A lot of that is as much tied up in the contract stipulations as it is the variability scientifically of what's going on. If you get in a prolonged drought, that's going to change your carbon in your soil. So it's a mixed point all the way around.
The question was, does the market respond to those variations in the landscape? Mhm. I'm just speaking to the YouTube folks right now.
Yeah, the question might be better, who has certainty? You know, you might, I might not. It depends on who you are. And we're talking about packaging and a partially imaginary exchange value. And it's like a stock price. Who has certainty that it'll remain? The carbon in the atmosphere will probably be there for a long time. Carbon in soil fluctuates quite a bit.
Oh, we have a question ready to go.
So I've got two simple questions, I guess. Could we quantify kind of what we're talking about? Is there like a minimum in like tons per acre that you need to have for this to even be worth the trouble? And the second question is, what are the opportunities for tribal entities here?
I don't know the answer to the first is, we don't know because there's all these other questions. And there are people marketing infinitesimal ones, because if you're willing to go market, you can market the sizzle, not the steak. And that may be where it's going. As far as what can happen for tribal entities, I think there very much is. We've been approached and we've collected baseline data for them to do that. And it comes down to the same thing that we've been talking around here is, do they have a way to market it? And do they have that person and are willing to put those efforts into marketing it? And what Greg has been talking about, and Byron's in the back, he's actually has done this in the developing world, is I think tribes have a real opportunity to package that carbon as part of their ecosystem services. And someone else mentioned it, the amount of calls that are coming in from Goldman Sachs and stuff, looking for a way to say they're doing this is good. And tribal entities tend to have huge amounts of land and lots of upside potential. So yes.
I would say to your first question, a minimum amount of carbon. Well, it depends, of course, but it's going to depend on what you have to do. If you've just installed the infrastructure, the fences and the water to really upgrade your grazing system, you're probably in a good place. If you've got 1,500 and 2,000 acre pastures like I do, and you would need to install a lot more infrastructure to change your surface management positively, the numbers are going to be different. It's very much an economics thing, and the numbers will be different because you're not going to get paid with additionality for what you're doing every day. There are contracts possibly on the horizon that will pay you for what you've got there currently, but yeah, it's going to be different for everybody where you're at in your management.
So we've got time for one more question on this panel.
Oh, good. I'm the last one. I guess this kind of ties in to what you were mentioning earlier about multiple ecological goods and services. You touched on water there. There's habitat, there's livestock production. We're having carbon being heavily monetized, which is going to drive producers' decision making. It's going to be a big influence. As a producer and a land manager, when we have this really driving decision making, what kind of risks are we putting ourselves into down the road when we're singular focused on one of those attributes? And I just maybe like to hear a couple comments of what we're setting ourselves up for by singular focused land management.
You mean singularly focused on carbon or the?
Yeah, so, yeah, when carbon's monetized, it's gonna affect our decision makers as land managers. We're gonna start doing things that are just gonna drive us to make, if there's a bunch of cash there, we're gonna do that, right? If cattle are gone, then we're gonna do whatever. What's that mean when we're just focused on carbon to other habitats, water quality, other ecological goods and services when we don't take a balanced approach to our land management?
I think that's one of the things we really have to guard against. I think we need to remain holistically focused, and this isn't just about one thing. And I think there's been a lot of mistakes made in the past where parks or different land managers have focused on one species and managed just for that one species. And then later on, we find that there were so many bad unintended consequences for what we did to try to do good. And I think that's the same here, that we need to just keep that holistic management at the front of our decision-making process always.
When you look at things like species or something like that versus functionality, get water in the ground. When water goes in the ground, good shit happens. Carbon, diversity, wildlife, all those things are. If you do a singular focus on how big's my weaning weight, you got a problem because it'll never be an optimum because that's so far up the line of values. When you're down at the bottom and that's where the leverage is. Get the water in the ground. How do you do that? So if I'm on a horse, which I never am, and I'm going around and I'm worried about my cattle, that same tool of managing the timing of herbivory, you're going to get this whole suite of values that society's worried about. They're not worried about generally about a plant, but you talk about changing water. Society's worried about water security. The byproduct will be carbon, and at the same time, it'll be the fertility in your cattle. And at the same time, it'll be the suite of neotropic birds across your landscape, which also, so singular focus is a problem when you're talking about something way up on the scale that has no leverage. But when you're down here and you're talking about how to make life by integrating water and sunshine through primary production, that's a different deal. And there will not be I've never found that it's a conflict when you focus down there. And that's when all of a sudden these broad suites of what people want and that the critters out there want and the downstream users want, it'll all happen at that point. Where's your focus?
Could be huge. I have one more question from YouTube. Are agencies all in agreement and supportive of this type of market? Or does that even matter since we're talking about private ground? Does anybody have a feel for that? We don't have an agency person on here, really.
I can answer that question really simple with the one word. No, the agencies are not all in agreement.
What about supportive?
Some of the agencies are supportive and some think they're being supportive when they're being the opposite. And others think they're being opposed when they're being supportive. Is that a fair sir?
That was the most clear and concise answer we've had all day from anybody. All right, we're going to wrap up the panel one part. It's gone way past where we planned. Who'd have guessed that a simple conversation about carbon would lead to this many questions. Please stick around. We're going to take just a couple minutes to get the aggregators up here so you can drill down to some really specific things on how these contracts work. I encourage everybody from the panel, if you can stick around to ask those important questions to the aggregators. I want to recap for those of you who are just joining us and those of us who are watching this in the future on YouTube. We just concluded panel 1, which was a question trying to answer anything you need to know about carbon. And we did little more than scratch the surface, I know, but I think what we did accomplish is give a good understanding of what questions you need to ask if you're headed in this direction, at least a start. And on that topic, Jeff handed this to me. It's Soil Carbon 101. I believe we can link to it in this video later. Just kind of building on that, those questions you need to be thinking about, need to be asking before you go too deep down this eternal rabbit hole of carbon sequestration. There was a lot of questions in the last panel, and I expect there to be more to these folks here. These are our aggregators, and when that phrase came to me the first time, I did not know what aggregators meant. I recently figured it out, and these folks are going to explain a little bit more about what they do, a little more detailed answers on the contracts themselves. The answer is always going to be it depends, so don't be too surprised if you don't get the specific answer you need, but this should lead you to asking those really valuable questions if you're heading down this road. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for introductions. And Chris, you want to start out?
My name is Chris Mahus, and I want to thank you all for inviting us here to talk about this. Thank Martin for the opportunity to talk about carbon credits. I'm a program director for the Western Sustainability Exchange. We're a nonprofit that's been in existence for 30 years now, working in the sustainability space, now titled the regenerative space, working with innovative ranchers to improve their practices and hopefully get them access to new market opportunities. So I will just lead my part off by saying it was fun to be in a session yesterday all day that talked about hope and excitement and ecosystem services and the way to get paid for these things. And nothing against the last panel. I think it was great. I think they asked a lot of questions, but it left me not feeling very hopeful. So I'm going to try to create some hope here and give you some examples of programs that we're trying to launch that might not be perfect, but we're putting our best into it, and we are putting money on the ground for improvements. So
it's no accident we had you guys last. We want to end on some hope.
My name is Colin Mitchell. I'm a nature-based solutions project manager at Native. We are a carbon project developer. We also sell our own credits. We produce wind partnership with the ranches and other projects we have around the world. We have been in business for 22 years, so we're not a startup. We are a public benefit corporation. We're employee owned, and we are a certified B Corp. As far as over the years, you may have seen us called Native Energy. We used to invest a lot in renewables before, they were popular, like they are now. So we have moved away from that. We do lots of project types, including biogas digesters for small landholders in Uganda, water filter projects. We work a lot with Ben and Jerry's on their biodigesters. And we also have a strong global grasslands presence as well. We've developed over 80 new projects that have all been validated and verified to a well-known third-party standard. Over $40 million have been invested in new projects of Native, and with an additional $200 million invested and an estimated 8 million tons of CO2 reduced. And I also manage our Northern Great Plains Improved Grazing program and help, other agricultural projects as well.
Thank you all. I am Breck Monks. I'm from Agoro Carbon Alliance. I'm based out of Saratoga, Wyoming. We have individuals clear across the nation. I am part of the science team. My technical term is carbon cropping agronomists. We are a firm that produces carbon credits to sell as well. We are project developers, but we are solely based in agriculture. We have row crop carbon projects as well as grassland carbon projects.
I know our time is short, so I won't take much time, but I did want to just talk a little bit about our project, our organization. As I said, we've been around for 30 years, and a little bit more on my background. I've worked in this carbon space before. I was part of the Chicago Climate Exchange project of 15 years ago, and I don't disagree with what Greg said about science and validation and verification of the credits. I think that was a problem. But I do also believe that one of the major reasons that effort failed before is because most of the motivation And the reason that companies were purchasing carbon credits, that was a voluntary market, just like this one that we're working in now. But most of the reason was driven by the threat of regulation. And so those companies were looking ahead. They were seeing that freight train coming downhill, and they wanted to get out and do something about it ahead of that. The motivations now are completely different. The public, consumers, the entire world is concerned about climate change. And so economics rather than politics and the threat of regulation are driving this market that we're talking about. And so a lot was said in the previous panel about demand. The demand is huge, and the opportunity is really here for us to do it. And I don't disagree that the science needs to be accurate and it needs to be verified, but we all know that scientists love to argue. And we know that the scientific method is flawed. And we also know that things in nature are really hard to measure. And so I would submit that we can't wait for the perfect science before we try something like this. And so Martin said something in the previous panel about action. So I really feel like if we can take advantage of this company money that's really being driven by consumers are demanding that companies do something about it. And there are ways to get that money on the ground to improve soil health, then I want to be a part of that. And I'm really excited to be up here talking to you about that. So I think we really face three big challenges from a grazing management standpoint. So really going back to the Society of Range Management and us all getting together for these conferences, I think we get to preach to one another. We're kind of preaching to the choir while we're here. We're in a select group of people that are doing some really innovative and exciting things. We can't forget about all the people back home, all of our neighbors that are looking across the fence thinking that we're weird and we're doing funny things, and they maybe don't trust that, but we can't build this for ourselves. We have to build this to be something that the general public and ranchers can adopt. So education is a huge hurdle. We need to get the information out there to people that explains to them that not only does it sequester carbon, but it creates lower input and greater profitability. Planning is a big issue. We need to have tools to help us plan better. And then the third thing is tracking change over time or documenting our practices. And I think that's something that probably almost all ranchers are guilty of. And Connie talked about the difficulty of time management and making the time for these things. But I really feel like a huge opportunity here is for ranchers to be able to document their grazing practices, kind of where they are today, what their baseline management is, and how they improve that over time. We'll be able to measure the ecological changes, and we can argue about whether those are valid or not. But ranchers have a real opportunity to measure your grazing management and how that changes over time. And there's numerous metrics that we can look at, and we can get into that more. I had several things that I was going to cover here, but I think I'll skip through most of that just to say that, and these points were raised in the previous one, but I think there's two main points that any carbon program I think needs to be focused around. The first one is permanence. And so it was talked about earlier, the fact that we need to have practices in place and commitment to improving practices over time. So that permanence is really key. So the length of the contract, the commitment of the people that are getting involved is really important. And then the second thing is that additionality piece. And I'll just tell a quick story on Bill Milton. A lot of you probably know him, but he's a part of the program that we're helping to launch with Native in Montana, the Northern Great Plains Project. And when I first brought Bill as a potential applicant to the program, the manager at the time said, no, we can't take people like Bill because you just have to look at his website. He's been doing holistic management since 1984. There's no additionality for him, or if there is, it's very limited. And that's true. Bill's very committed to this. He's been doing a better job than most anybody else for a long time. But when we sat down, he uses a grazing consultant there in Montana because he's got a lot of BLM ground. He's been doing a lot of monitoring for a lot of years. And when we sat down and looked at his system, and he had limited water delivery. So he had a lot of water sources, but he didn't have a lot of recharge. So in order to be able to stock higher and have shorter graze periods, he needed greater volume and greater recharge in each of those places. So he was able to increase his pipeline to 2 inches throughout the ranch. And he went from a from grace periods of 3 to 7 days to daily moves. And sometimes of the year, he moves 3 times a day. So that additionality is there, the opportunity is there. And there's just a lot of great opportunities in this. So with that, I'll leave it for questions. I'll turn it over to Colin and let him talk about their program.
Yeah, is it okay if I open up the hood a little bit for y'all first? Because I want people to be able to dig around. All of our stuff's publicly available. We're the only Vera VCS validated improved grazing project in the Western Hemisphere, the Northern Great Plains.
Can you spell out VCS?
It's a verified carbon standard. Vera is the methodology company. Being validated means you have a third party that comes in, grills us, says, hey, you're playing by the rules of what this methodology looks like. Our methodology for the Northern Great Plains was written by the United Nations Food and Ag Organization, and they have a rigorous process to get those methodologies created. If you want an idea of what validation looks like, we have a project in Argentina that is with the Savory Hub down there. And we are in the middle of it, and we just got 91 findings back we're having to work through and explain and justify and work all the way through. Being validated and verified is basically get audited. You're playing by the rules you said you play by, us and the ranchers. People say they're partnering with Vera, they use Vera methodologies. If they're not on the registry, they're not getting validated and verified. There's a difference. We open up the hood, everything's publicly available online, soil sampling methodology, everything like that. What Chris was mentioning with our infrastructure, we have something called Help Build, which basically provide upfront funding for the ranches to be able to get this infrastructure to participate in the carbon program. We do not believe that you should bear the cost of the transition alone or that furtherance of your practices to be able to participate in a carbon program. I'm happy to talk about that more. It's a little complex. That's a problem with carbon markets. It is complex. I'm happy to talk about soil sampling. I made sure I talked to our soil teams before that and looking at that. We use a model, but we also soil sample 3 times the amount that the clean development mechanism requires. It's the UN IPCC tool that allows us to do that because we believe the methodologies are at the low bar and you need to go above that. But yeah, I'd rather just open up for questions and diddle through my PowerPoint. So.
Excellent. Similar to Native, we are in the process of getting our projects verified at Agoro. We follow standard methodologies presented through Vera. Up to now, we have provided $12 million to producers for implementation of carbon farming. And that predominantly has actually gone to grassland acres, which is pretty exciting in the United States. We are backed by Yara International. So even though we are a startup, we are not generally out there looking for startup funds. We get to spend our time with the producers and signing up acres and getting this knowledge out that these 2 individuals have been talking about.
I'm going to open it up to questions. But I'm going to start with my own first. Every carbon discussion I see or read about, we talk about the voluntary and the regulatory side of things, and we take the regulatory and just is the regulatory side of this something we should be looking at, concerned about? If things go that direction, is it still through you? Does the program look the same? It's just how it's handled on the other end.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, if we're talking cap and trade, there's a lot of cap and trade scenarios that could come to be. If we look at California's example, they still allow offsets. 8% was what they started, went down to 4, and I think it's going back to 6. If it's a cap and trade where they do still allow folks to, have offsets and get into that, and we know we sell on an international market. So if it was an optional thing, we would look at see if it would make you more money. If it doesn't make you more money, then we would, do what's best on your behalf and make sure you get the most, bang for your buck with the sale of your carbon credits. If there's a validation, requirement, I have no worry about that. We go above and beyond what is the strictest standard on the voluntary carbon market currently. If we need to change the model, we'll do what we need to do. So.
Yeah, I think the regulatory question is a good one. In the previous panel, they talked a lot about trust, and Colin, I think can speak more, and Breck probably too, to these are really early stage, nascent stage trading platforms. So I think we're learning a lot. But what I have more experience with the native model. Native is being very transparent to the purchasers of this carbon as to exactly what they're buying. When we started this project with them 4 years ago, just to give you an example of the whole pay to pollute issue, Xanterra Parks and Resorts was one of the first buyers of those carbon credits. And because of the optics of it, Native was and is still really careful about the companies that purchase credits from the program. They work really hard to ensure these companies are doing everything they can do internally to evaluate their waste streams and evaluate their electricity use and all those consumptive things that contribute to their carbon footprint. Native wants to know, and in fact, every rancher that I've worked with in our program wants to know what those companies are doing on their own first before they go to some market to offset their credits. So I think that's a really important aspect of all of this. And Xanterra Parks and Resorts, I started down that path. I'll just finish it. They've been on our board, Western Sustainability Exchange, as a contributing member for 25 years. They've had a sustainability department within their business. They've got a fully staffed sustainability department that works really hard on all of those things. They're trying to do all they can do internally. They manage a lot of national and international parks. And so their interest is in they're selling the environment. I mean, they're part of marketing the environment to people that want to recreate. And so it's in their best interest to do everything they can internally before they go to a market to offset the rest of those. So anyway, the regulatory side of things, I think, will develop, and it's the role of government to come in and create trust where there isn't trust. But to me, if you have a voluntary market where the producers are giving the information they need to ensure the buyers of the credits that everything is being done and is above board, then less regulation is required.
So this voluntary market is keeping the regulatory side at bay, the success of this.
Yeah, and I think at some point there will be need for regulation, but but it really boils down to that issue of trust that was talked about in the first panel.
Just one thing to add there. In the voluntary market, we have a really special situation right now, because if we write the methodologies correctly and we essentially instigate a universal standard to the soil methodologies for monitoring and keeping soil health and ecosystem health as one of the key drivers of this, the regulatory market will eventually look at us and say, they've got a wonderful standard, and we'll pick that up because everybody likes to piggyback off of a wonderful framework. So we have a great opportunity right now.
Thanks. I know we have a question ready to go in the back.
Hello, thanks for being here. I've been attending all of the carbon talks all week from Monday to today. And one of the biggest take homes was summed up really well by Jeff. He said something like, he said something really, really wise. He said, here we have a room, full of some of the best scientists, right, at our fingertips who aren't agreeing. And then we have an industry out there, right, who are not waiting for us. We're not waiting. And I see that I work in this world, and I see that the train has left the station, and it's like we're talking different languages, because I hear a lot of uncertainty there. I hear a lot about uncertainty, right? Where the dynamics, and there's fractionation, and there's different depths, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And is carbon doing what we think it's doing by our measures, by our ability to observe it? And then on the other hand, I hear tons of certainty, like we've sequestered 1% because of we've increased our carbon by 1% since we've changed our management. And if we've stored carbon, and there's a lot of certainty in the language on the other side. So I'm trying to figure out how to, can you help us understand, how do you resolve those two, that dualism? And someone asked something about risk earlier, but I wasn't satisfied that we answered who really is taking the risk. So Vera, for example, one of their older methodologies, I really want to understand. So Vera, is under the microscope right now because of one of their failed methodologies in forest systems. If these new grassland methodologies don't end up doing what are measuring or saying what they don't end up doing what they're saying they're doing after 25 years, 30 years, 50 years, who's responsible? Who's at risk? Is that
Yeah,
clear?
no, totally. So basically my job, I talk to ranchers all day long and answer these questions. So that's great. So as far as, with the methodologies uncertainty, I can get into our soil sampling methodology and the depths, and happy to do that. We're honestly always looking for continuous improvement. We model and we soil sample more than we're required to. We're only required to model. That's not good enough. So we decided to sample as well, 3 times the amount we'd be required to for a measure to measure project. We're looking into remote sensing technologies. A lot of people we've talked to, I haven't been happy with the data privacy. We're employee owned. Your data exists with us. We don't give it out. I'm cagey about it, Greg. We should talk later because I'm very interested. As far as on the risk, if you're in the project, so we do measurement validations and we do modeling verifications and measurement. If we get to the end of the project 30 years, because we have a 20-year payment period, 30-year contract, so 10-year permanence period after that, you did everything you said you did. You managed both baseline. You did a stellar job. We go measure, there's no carbon there. We take a reversal. Native does. You do not pay us back anything we've given you. We take that hit. We have a global portfolio of different types of projects. That's our responsibility. It's not there. What Vera calls a reversal. So that's on us.
Similar to Native, we have a 10-year contract at Agoro, and through your management history and records, if you've shown that you have done everything in our contract that you signed up to do, and similar to Natives, the soil didn't store the carbon that we had anticipated through modeling and measurement, then that is on Agoro in the long run.
Yeah, and to go back to the beginning of your question, I really feel like we have to start somewhere. We have to innovate in this space, and we're going to make mistakes. And are we leaving the science behind? Absolutely not. I mean, these projects are based on sound science. Is it the right science? Is it the science that you like or that you've studied your whole life? Maybe not, but we will continue to improve that. So I think the real answer to your question is, at what point do you have permission to try something? And I think, I mean, I was part of the CCX 15 years ago, and we tried then and we did our best and it didn't work out, and we're trying again. And so, going back to the previous panel, there were 9 people on the questions panel, and there's 3 people on the answers panel. So it's true. We're in the nascent stages of this, and it's not us against them. Those questions are all very valid, and we need to address all of those if this is going to create trust between the buyer and the producer.
And I just want to add one more thing. We sample 10 to 20 sites, 3 samples per site. We'd love to do more. I asked, why don't we do more to my soil sampling team? And it's commercially unfeasible. We have to pay third-party professional soil sampling teams, and we are bound by the price of carbon. So we're stuck in a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation. And I asked, well, what's going to take it to sample more companies to pay more for carbon? So like I said, we don't have a big ag tech company behind us. It's me and 29 other people that own the company. So per site. So we have 10 to 20 sampling sites per ranch. To get to the scale we want, I did the math. I think we'll end up having 600 to 700 sites, and then 3 samples per site, 0 to 30 centimeters is what we take. Yeah, and then we do bulk density, take out the gravel, measure the gravel. So,
Colin, before our next question, I just want to get clarification. You were talking about user privacy and also talking about everything being public. I just want to give you a chance to
Yeah.
differentiate those.
So our methodologies and how we do things are public. The ranch's information is private and the ranch location is private. We use big stars to indicate where our initial project incidences are, so you cannot find them. Even when I'm talking to different ranches that are neighbors that I know they're talking to each other, I feel cagey about even bringing that up, and I don't say each other's names, even though they will say it to me. It all exists on our drive. No one can access it. MRV companies are calling us constantly to want to collaborate. And the first thing they ask for, even on the first call, is for the rancher's data. And we say no.
What's MRV?
Monitoring, reporting, and validation, verification.
Thanks.
So yeah, there's a lot of people who want your data, and we're employee owned and we don't give it out. I'm very protective of it. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that. Let's go to Sherm with that next question.
So as I think about this question of the need for sampling in a variable environment and the expense of that, it seems to me that probably you have this prioritized mental image of your opportunity set, and prioritized because some things are sort of like slam dunk simple and other things get really complicated and hard to sample. And I presume that the first place to store carbon on rangelands is to get your riparian areas functioning properly, because they had such tremendous soil carbon and they lose it when the channel incisors, and when you get the riparian functions back, you can store tremendous amounts of carbon. I assume that another place that is high priority is where back in the day, they turned the grass blades side down and the root side up, and we lost tremendous soil carbon because we plowed the ground. And now we can put it back to permanent perennial pasture. And it's really easy to see the signal from that, probably from space, but probably also from sampling soil carbon. And then there's the other sets of opportunities. And I'm curious, did I get it right? And what is the rest of that prioritized list? What are the easy ones on down to what are the harder ones?
So where's the low hanging fruit in this?
Yeah, I'll start out the answer and then I'll let you guys continue it. The way our program works is we don't dictate anything to the ranch about how they change their management. We really listen first, and we meet with them. We get them. A lot of ranches don't really have a very good set of maps even for the ranch. So we try to get them a good inventory of maps, pasture delineations, pasture sizes, what their baseline management is. And then we work with them on that low hanging fruit. Typically, it is those more productive areas. So hay fields that have been converted that maybe are still irrigated and have an opportunity, riparian areas, the smaller areas that are more productive are a way to gain more economically in the short term. And usually obviously riparian areas are close to water. So are the hay fields. A lot of times are close to the buildings. So it's a convenient place to start. So I would say that probably, yes, that is true what you say, but I think in the end, we're not going to affect significant change unless we meet the ranchers at their kitchen table, talk this over with them, and do all of this on their terms.
So you don't dictate, but I assume all of you have suggestions on where to start with your next best management practices.
Yeah. Without every single ranch that I've worked with has been looking for guidance, looking for help. And so we provide some of that. The other thing that we're working really hard on in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming as a nonprofit is networking. So there's a lot of ranchers that have succeeded and failed and succeeded again and tried different things. We're trying to get those stories out there. We're trying to connect and create a lot of rancher to rancher communication so they can learn that from one another.
Yeah, we're not overly prescriptive. There's certain things we'd like to see, but context is king, and it's going to vary ranch to ranch. And our goal is to more empower than dictate from our offices. So that's really how we feel about it. As far as the wetlands, we actually have to remove wetlands from our project area. That's just how it works. That's how the methodology dictates. So we do it using GIS. We take them out, but not riparian. No, yeah, but wetlands we take out. Our modeling and our soil sampling is randomized. The computer program puts randomized dots after we take out buildings, wetlands, and and roads. Yes, thank you. Structures, buildings, and forested areas. It's a grasslands project. So, whatever the measurement is, it is all randomized. We look for good partnerships. We're not solely concerned with, hey, do you have a degraded farmland that you're trying to convert back? This is a long-term contract and we want it to be a really good partnership. And also where we are right now in Montana and parts of Wyoming and Idaho, that's all Vero to give us, that's part of using a third-party methodology is they won't give you certain geographic areas. It hasn't been much farmland going back to grassland. It's been a lot of people who are managing grassland that has been degraded. But we will eventually expand out of Montana later this year. And I'm sure as we get to other places, that will be the case and there'll be some reseeding.
So just to dig in a little bit deeper, how long does it take you to get the information, the financial information on whether this management, this change in management is worth doing against the measurement costs? Is that a long process or do you have that information?
So
readily
within
available?
Agoro, we actually can sit down with the rancher directly at their kitchen table and have this information immediately based on per acre calculations and what practices they choose to sign up for within Agoro.
Yeah, so native covers all verification, validation, soil sampling, and registry costs. The price you see is what you get. We pay all ranchers the same rate per ton. You'll see some projects where they're advertising $30 a ton, but you have to pay for verification and validation. So there's a bunch of hidden fees and costs. That is not the case with native. We also adjust the price every 3 years. And we show you how we did our calculations, what the new price is. We decided not to do a percent share. We do it in Argentina and we do it in other places because we got flags from the Securities Exchange Commission that if they started getting involved within it, there would be potential downfalls for our ranchers and that folks would have to be certified investors with the SEC. So we are avoiding that. We are going to go through the administrative, process of doing it every 3 years. We looked at every year and we just can't feasibly do that adjustment. We also have a floor price, so it'll never go below a certain price.
So if you have those set prices already, to somebody else's question in the earlier panel, there must be a minimum at that point. If you can't guarantee a floor price, if it's not worth it for you.
Yeah, I don't know what happened if it went, to 2 cents or, we may just have to.
In terms of amount of carbon.
As far as amount of carbon, of what we can guarantee, are you talking about like performance or can you elaborate a little bit?
Storage, or you're talking about like the guaranteed price per ton?
No, carbon storage. If I come to you with some piss poor ground.
Yeah.
No, there's a certain point that it's not worth your time, I assume. And what level is that?
We haven't gotten to that point where I've said your land's in such bad shape that's not the case. One of the benefits, 20 and 30 years sounds like a long time, but there's a ramp up period and that's why we pay for infrastructure to be able to enable that change rather than putting it all that on you.
Okay, I had promised to get back to audience questions now, sorry. Microphone's right there.
I have a question, I guess, comments that you made, Breck. You said if someone has signed a contract and they don't reach the target, after your 10-year period and they have adequate records to show that they've done the things they signed up for. I'm just curious, what are the adequate records? What level of detail would you expect from a rancher?
So essentially with Agoro, we have a 1-year look back period. So if you instigated a change within the last 365 days, let's say you improved your rotational grazing, you can still be enrolled. We asked for data 3 years back, essentially it's baseline management data, and that's looking at herd size when you rotate it. Essentially, if you were doing stuff off of more like grazing days and how much standing forage was out there. We asked for absolutely no financial information, and we take the risk on similar to native for all of your guys' soil sampling and that type of costs. We are backed by Yara International, which is a European company out of Norway. We have very, very, very stringent data laws, and we do not share any data whatsoever either. So the information that we ask for in your baseline goes into our modeling, and it has a lot to do with the climate models we utilize.
I got a microphone there and then coming this way.
I just wanted to okay, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on Anna Claire's question from earlier about risk and uncertainty. I'm a soil biogeochemist working in rangeland systems. I do a lot on sampling optimization. And I think the point that was made earlier about collecting I feel like I'm eating it. Collecting only 3 samples is part of the uncertainties that soil scientists like myself and others in the room are trying to make, which is that the power to detect and accurately quantify soil carbon change on the basis of 3 samples is almost 0. And so right now it costs more to collect as many samples as it takes to do that accurately than it costs than it would pay on the basis of 1 ton of carbon offset. So how do companies like the ones you all are working for grapple with some of these uncertainties, knowing that if we're generating offsets on the basis of very high uncertainty, there's a real cost to society, which is maybe not mitigating climate change to the extent that we think we are?
Yeah, so we, in our Northern Great Plains, it's 30 to 60 samples per ranch. We'd like to do more. Again, the commercial feasibility aspect of it. We also use a model. So I'm going to use our Kenya project as an example. It's the largest improved grazing project in the world. It's 2 million hectares. We work with tribal herders chasing cows across the landscape. We use a model that was peer reviewed, and then I'm not sure to the number of samples we take on that landscape. I don't work on that project, to be candid. I only asked about the one I manage. As far as that one goes, we did our measurement verification. We've gone through 2 verifications. We're about to be on our 3rd. And it was within the statistical error that was allowed for the model and the measurement under the methodology. We are using soil sampling data to feed the model to get it better and more better. By the time we're at scale in Montana, we will have anywhere between, I think we'll have about anywhere from 2,400 to 7,200 samples in central and eastern Montana, feeding that model to make it better. But again, we are interested in other technology like remote sensing to help cheer that up and make it better. It's not required of us, but we think it's important to do that. And we are continuously improving as we go. And that's part of my job, is how can we push and make it better from a communication standpoint, making it make sense for the ranchers, making the ranchers feel comfortable. It doesn't help to get 6 years in and they didn't know what's going on. I always encourage ranchers to hire a lawyer, work through that contract. And how can we get better science as we're moving on? That is internal data. We could look at a public-private partnership. I also worry about putting a finger on a scale of research as well. As far as the credits that are issued, that data will be publicly available on the registry.
Just to respond to that, and then I think this will hit on the previous question too. I work on the rancher side of things, so my responsibility is everything on the ground, working with the ranchers themselves. And I think, as I said before, scientists will always argue about the number of samples, the depth we need to sample at, what laboratory method is the best one for actually measuring carbon change over time. And, that's good. That's the scientific method, and scientists need to argue. That's what makes models stronger. That's what makes science more accurate. The question becomes, when is it good enough to start something? And I think that the science is what builds the trust between the consumer and the producer. So that part needs to be there. But how good does it need to be? How many people need to check the yes box to say that it's good enough for us to have a system that takes money from companies and puts it on the ground? Because I'll back up a little bit and say the alternative is that the government creates a cap and trade program, which we've been talking about for 30 years, and we're still not there. California has one. Oregon and Washington have some form of one. There's some eastern states that are doing that. That's not happening very quickly. I'm not a patient person. I know this money needs to be invested on the range now. And so I'm looking for solutions. So the other thing I'll say is that the rancher has a real opportunity to start collecting his or her own data. And so there are online formats that are available. My Grazing and Pasture Map are 2 of them, we're actually creating our own out of this project as a nonprofit, along with some software developers that doesn't have nearly the learning curve to be able to use. And it also will allow you to incorporate any monitoring or like ecological data in the same platform as your grazing. So I mentioned it before, but I'll go into it a little bit more now. What we can do with this grazing program is we can look at things like your rest periods. So if, simply stated, if you start with 10 pastures and you go to 100, then you're going to have different graze frequency, different days on pasture. You're going to have different stock densities. You're going to have different rest periods. Then all of those things can be measured over time. And that's data that you can use for carbon markets. That's data you can use for other ecosystem services. That's data that you can use in your beef marketing. All of those things are things that differentiate your management from everyone else's, considering the constraints that you have and the opportunities that are in front of you. So I think there's a real great opportunity in front of us with that, to be able to really measure our change in grazing management over time and use that in our marketing going forward.
Yeah, the only other point I wanted to make is we at Native are pushing carbon offsets are not going to solve the problem. Companies need to drastically reduce their emissions. We have never sold to an oil and gas company. We have not sold to a large meat processor. We push for our companies to have reduction plans in accordance with the Paris climate agreements. And we're also pushing for offsets not to be used towards corporate net zero anymore and to be pushed for global accounting of emissions reductions. So it's not about their brand, it's about collectively reducing emissions. There needs to be improvements in science and affordability, and there needs to be improvements on scope 3 emissions calculations because they're messy.
Sorry. You mentioned it's less about their brand. Does that change the value of what they're willing to pay for that carbon?
No, we've really been pushing for reduce the emissions you can reduce, whatever you have left, put a number on of what that value is to you for the remaining carbon reductions you haven't been able to meet. Invest the rest of that in R&D to be able to reduce your emissions further and pick up a certain amount. You can't offset your way into, out of the problem we're in, and put a number on offsets and then invest in those. And we, try to have a lot of corporate involvement. We're going to have an event in June. It's closed where we're going to have 15 brands and 15 ranches. And we're going to do site visits and tours of some of the ranches and have dinner. And so we're going to put faces and names and they can see the communities they're investing in.
Thanks. Did you want to follow up? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. This one comes from one of our online folks. How do spray projects to treat invasive annual grasses and promote perennial grasses factor into additionality? I'm going to ask also, can you really define additionality for us? What that looks like?
So additionality is not only required by Vera, the registration firm, but it is also required by a lot of buyers of credits. You can have various management practices that are approved by Vera that you can get carbon credits for. Agoro in particular only functions in 3. It is nitrogen use, it is rotational grazing, and it is increase in biodiversity of forages on the landscape for grassland scenarios. In this case, when it comes to spraying, if our agronomists go out and sign a producer up for nitrogen use and rotational grazing, it's with the caveat we need to clean up those annual weedy species before we add nitrogen. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with a field of more annuals, right? And Agoro can help front load the cash for that spray and to help do that. Anytime you add biomass into the soil, the microbes get excited and that goes into organic matter. They don't care if it's a chocolate chip cookie or an oatmeal cookie. They're not like us and have a preference. They look at that annual weedy species or a perennial and say, hey, the refrigerator opened, and they're going to go straight after it. So in that case, those species are going to get decomposed and stored. They don't care. It will be carbon in some format.
So along those lines, when you have an oatmeal cookie like cheatgrass and the alternative is bare ground, is there any value in that? Oh, something over nothing?
So we don't want bare ground, obviously, because we lose median when we have bare ground. We also have an issue with our active microbial population who's doing the heavy lifting with this CNN cycling that we're interested in storage. I'm not advocating promote cheatgrass by any means. We want live cover because when you have a live root system in particular, that's when we're cycling and adding nutrients back into that profile that microbes can chew up and then store as inorganic, organic matter moving toward plant production.
Okay, I've got like 1,000 of my own questions, but I see a microphone over there in somebody's hands.
Yeah, so in this sagebrush steppe ecosystems in this region here, ranchers are very concerned about the science. They are the ones reaching out to us for credible science as to how productive in terms of carbon sequestration the sagebrush steppe ecosystems can be. One of the concerns they have is about, and here's a question for your companies, if the conservation easements are better pay for them than going into a carbon program. That's part A. And the part B of that is, can the two of them, conservation easement and a carbon program, be combined into one or be part of the same? Otherwise, can they get money from the conservation and money from the carbon program?
Short answer, yes. Conservation easements, you're basically saying you're not going to change anything. We're paying for that change in carbon over time. Conservation easements are typically keeping it. And actually, it makes us feel better that it's not going to get change back from grasslands. It depends on the type of easement and things like that. But with our program, it has to stay in grasslands for 30 years. We have, I think, have the longest permanence period of any grasslands project that I'm aware of. And we monitor that whole time. So it depends a little bit on the type. So I can't give you like every answer, but we do have people that have conservation easements, basically saying they're not going to put anything out of grasslands, and then we pay for that additional carbon.
The question for online and future is, can you put a carbon program on top of CRP?
So if you're excluding cattle and it's something we have to actually exclude cattle, we probably can't include that in the carbon program. We're paying for grazing, in grazing lands and working lands. If it's removed from working lands, we cannot credit that. Short answer.
Oh, you're right on.
In your methodology, what is your ideal ranch model? Would it be somebody that has sprayed Rejuva or somebody that has grass this high? And do you have to have that story with this program too, to make it work for you?
Well, I'll just speak from the ranch perspective. I've worked with ranches that are just starting, that have set stock grazing, and they're thinking about putting in a rotational system, improving their water and moving cattle every couple months, up to the story I told about Bill Milton. And from a soil health perspective, some would argue that if you have really damaged soil, it's going to be a while before you wake up the microbiome community, before it really starts generating more life and going to work. So some would argue that a Bill Milton type management probably has more, is going to sequester carbon more quickly than a soil that's really damaged. So I'm going to be a lawyer and say it depends, but I think improvement is there for everyone. And I feel like everyone has the opportunity to be a part of a program like this.
Or what if you don't make progress for that year and it's good grassland?
Progress in terms of actual carbon?
Yeah.
Yes, we soil sample every 5 to 10 years. If anything, it's going to recalibrate the model. And if, we go and sample and it's significantly underperformed, you don't pay anything back. We will adjust the model and probably slow payment rates to try to make it match up better. And we have that every 5 to 10 years for 30 years. So we'll be tracking that. We can only pay for 20, but there's a chance we may pause payment at some point if it's drastically different and sample more frequently, and we'd pay for the cost of that sampling. But we don't sample year to year. We have the model because it allows us to be able to deliver payments on a yearly basis rather than every 5 to 10 years from a measure to measure standpoint. But yeah, that's the risk that Native takes. If you're managing above baseline of what you said you would, and you're doing a great job and it's not there, then that risk is on Native. And then we have to pay it back in kind of reversal, and all those credits that the company said they were buying go away.
So if your 5-year measurement comes up on a drought year or post-fire or something like that, it's on you to resample the next year, or do we have to be as worried about those climatic or those certain events that could throw everything off?
So Vera has a buffer that they hold, the credits that are held in reserve that are not sold for inadvertent reversals, fires. So they always hold that. So, Native wouldn't be responsible for that. That would be Vera's responsibility. If it's a reversal where something else happens when you leave the project or something like that, that's where you hire a lawyer, go through the remedies and damages section, and ask all your what if questions. I really encourage a lawyer. I want our ranchers to feel comfortable. It doesn't do me any good if you don't know all the what ifs that come down the line.
Back to the beginning of your question about who is the ideal land manager to enroll. We're forgetting the other part of this whole entire scenario. We want somebody who's passionate about soil health, because that guarantees all of us up here that we're also going to make a profit. We don't want somebody who's just looking for cash and who's going to run and not actually implement these practices. In fact, we are paying for it. That being said, this also goes to the idea of additionality. If your grass is this tall, that's great. And you've been rotating every 7 days, X amount ahead, we have to be able to show in that additionality that we're changing your production system in some way. We're adding a new practice. It could be rotating quicker. It could be making paddocks smaller. It could be changing your herd size. We could introduce that new forage species. It's very personal to you. So there isn't a one size fits all scenario. And that's why saying I don't qualify isn't a good option in this market, because we can tailor things directly to each producer.
So great set of panels here. The takeaway, I think, from an extension standpoint from the first panel, from the producer side, was run the contracts by a lawyer, talk to an accountant. You guys are actually managing these, working every day with land managers out there. If you had to simply sum up, what's the best advice you could give a producer based on the experiences you've had that's thinking about going into one of these contracts that would help them and everybody?
Yeah. First off, be skeptical. I don't think that's hard. It's deserved, and we don't take it personally. You have every right to be. I live in Texas and I work in Montana a lot. I'm not from Montana, Chris is. So that's why we always have on the ground partners with all of our projects. Second, listen. Third, ask a lot of questions. If you don't know what questions to ask, find the right person to ask questions. I had a rancher who we're probably going to contract with. He's talking to us and someone else. He didn't know what questions to ask. I gave him a list of questions. I want the ranchers to feel comfortable. These are partnerships. We're in it for the long haul. I half joke that, that it's not a contract, it's a prenup because it's 30 years. Fourth, evaluate how it fits in your context, in your business, your values, your goals. If it doesn't fit, then don't sign up. It's all voluntary, and the success of these markets it's democratized by choice. Really take a look, how does it fit with your succession plan? How does it fit with your family? You really need to take stock and take your time. I don't push the ranchers that are coming to our program. I want them to take their time to think about these things. And, the last one is push for continuous improvement. I also tell the ranchers in our program, don't pull any punches on me. We have informational sessions with contracted ranches and ranches that are thinking about contracting, and I want them to say whatever they feel they need to say. And I also offer up, and I ask the ranchers before I give out their phone number, but do you want to talk to someone in our program with us not there? You know, I welcome that. I want that. So that's kind of my advice to ranches.
I'll put this out to, I want to add to that. Do you agree with the first panel that you don't need a specific, a lawyer with a very specific scope in this? Is this something that your current lawyer should be able to handle, or is it something we should be seeking very specific help on legally?
I think if you have a very great general lawyer, it could be an option, but if it is a land trust lawyer or a mineral lawyer, I think they are probably a lot better versed in this. And that's the route I would go to follow up on your question and to follow up on what Colin said. When I sit down with producers, sometimes they're shocked because I'm more interested in what they need for their forage production and what they need from their livestock than selling a carbon credit. And we can tailor projects specifically for that. But the other thing is we spend a lot of time just implementing the knowledge for the carbon program. One, transparency is a big deal. If you sit down with a carbon individual and they're not willing to say that, you know, the floor price of carbon is $16.50 a ton, and they won't give you a number, there's an issue there. One big question I always tell producers to ask when you sit down with folks is ask the person what kind of carbon credit they're actually generating. And it can be a carbon storage credit, or it can be a greenhouse gas offset credit. And those two types of credits go to two different, very different buyers, or they have a different grand scope. Much like Colin says, check your values and check what you want to do. Check with your accountant, because some of these upfront payments and the payments you might get in year 5 and year 10 could be very, very large, and you have to have a game plan for that moving forward. And that can become a hassle with folks.
Yeah, my biggest advice would be don't learn this on your own. Every time, Colin mentioned it, but every time I've asked a rancher if he'd be willing to talk to a peer about this, they can't wait to share their story. So learn from others' experiences. Don't wait around. Get out there and try some things to improve your grazing management. Make some mistakes. Experiment. Build out your water. Get those improvements made. Don't wait to do that. And then the other big thing is, at least the native contract is 30 years. Some of them are 10, some of them are 20. These are long time commitments. So check with your kids and check with your family members and make sure that everyone's on board. Be thinking about if you're going to sell it in 10 years or what your future plans might be. Carbon markets need that permanence in order to create that trust and assurance that the carbon sequestration is going to continue to happen and that carbon is going to stay in the soil. So if you're thinking about getting rid of the ranch or getting into farming or doing something that doesn't sequester carbon, this isn't for you. This isn't going to work.
Just to follow that up, in the last panel, it was made as a point if the contract can be transferable. And that is important because you can't guarantee that, you know, in 8 years, God forbid something happens to you, that your wife is wanting to take over, your husband wants to take over this contract, or your kids will want to take over this contract. Maybe it's a situation of a new landowner, and make sure that the contract is in fact transferable. Agaro's is transferable.
Ours is also transferable. Also look at kind of stipulations. We have a section there. We expect you to stay in the project. You're making a commitment. Don't sign until you come to that commitment, but it's within a commercially reasonable effort. If you get cancer and you can't ranch anymore and you have to sell the ranch, we're not going to hold your feet to the fire. Like, we're going to let you out of the program. You know, like if there's some reason it's commercially reasonable that you need to leave or stop ranching, that's like it's a free out. There's a gradient of things. As I said, get a lawyer, ask your what if questions. You should have like 20 of them. And, you know, our co-founder is also our legal counsel. It's no cost to us. We'll have a meeting between our lawyers, or you and our lawyer, whatever you need, you know, just to talk through things and get you the comfort level to say yes or no, you know.
I'd like to thank the 3 speakers. I heard things like not wanting regulations and that data is not made public. I'm a soil scientist. I also heard, changing from 5-day rotation to 3-day or 1-day can make a difference. I have a lot of trouble believing that that is measurable. Without data being public and the concern about not wanting regulation, it's easy to imagine that across the sector that there will become bad actors. So you mentioned that validation cost money. Ranchers going to want the most money that they can get. And it seems that there's some risk that they may fall victim to new companies that are less reputable. As I mentioned, I know how the measurements are done. I mean, I can easily imagine spiking or there's ways to get the result that you want so that you have credits and you're profitable. What if down the road that's found out? Right now there's afforestation projects that there's lots of questions, but we can at least see with remote sensing that there are trees on the ground. We can't see soil carbon stocks. So, I mean, I do trust what you've said, that you have samples and you have models that are convincing you that you either have accrual or not, but it's so easy to imagine that there will be bad actors that are going to, overestimate sequestration and sell more stocks and make more profit and undercut you because they will have lower costs and validation. Isn't that, I mean, I wish the lawyer were still here, but it seems like if you had a company that really cared that they were potentially defrauded, that some of that risk can extend to the rancher.
Well, I guess I'll go back to the regulatory part of your question. I might have been the one that said that, and I did not mean to say that there isn't a place for regulation and that regulation doesn't add value. I think that's a key part of creating that trust and assurance that things are all above board and that everyone's doing everything in the best interest, using the best science, the best documentation available. So I think, regulation will come when the regulators can agree on it and have a method to become involved in the transaction. Until then, we're really relying on transparency and the reporting mechanisms, at least in this case, that are part of international bodies that peer review and audit these processes. So I'll leave it at that and let you guys.
Yeah, so at least with our validation, they come out, the VBB comes out and watches a soil sample. Well, we don't soil sample, we hire a third party to do it. And that's just to have a chain of custody where we're not touching it. We want as many third parties involved as possible. We're planning to use the same soil lab. We're having to switch because we did a baseline sample and they threw out our gravel before measuring it. And we had to resample a bunch of stuff. So please, if you work for a soil health lab, please don't throw out gravel before measuring it. And then actually, I do worry about bad actors constantly. That honestly is the thing that worries and being put in the mix with them. As far as like if a company went out and spiked their samples, I hope they have indemnification clauses in their contract. We do that protects them from that, the ranchers from that, if there was a bad actor. Or if a company wanted to come after the ranches, they can't. There's indemnification clauses in there. This came up recently, and I am paraphrasing a little bit because a lawyer, my co-founder, gave me a huge long paragraph. So for the lawyer room, I apologize if that's not totally satisfactory. Okay, cool, awesome. So yeah, I do worry about it. I am actually fine with regulation as long as it makes sense. And I wish we'd all just agree to use the same standards. It would make me feel a lot better. And then companies could shop around with ethics and values, and then we're all in the same playing field. But the whole Wild West scenario, I think, does hold true a little bit. And yeah, I would like to see a rising tide raise all the ships, but yeah, that's not there yet. So, our soil samples aren't, I don't think, readily available where you can go look at them. Maybe that's something we could change over time. I do want there to be as much transparency as possible while protecting data privacy. It feels like sometimes there's trade-offs we're working with. But our methodologies and our verifiers are audited by the, methodology company. We have to revalidate every decade. So it is rigorous, but I'm open to more rigor.
Yes, if there is more rigor and it's universal rigor, just like in science, it builds a robust program, right? And we need to get on that page for sure. But we can't share data sets because they're GPS tagged. So that's then would be data privacy issues, and we're not going to do that. Vera has a stringent set of standards from when it comes to third-party soil samplers, third-party analysis, and Native does the same thing as Agoro. And so we keep our hands completely off of it because that was a common problem in 15, 20 years ago, and the greenwashing aspect of it. Because those samples are GPS tagged, they can't be doubly sold because Vera will check on that. That's part of the auditing, that we know where that sample came from as a company.
We got time for just one more question. We got Jeff on deck.
Yeah, we've been hitting around additionality a whole lot today, right? I still think that's a barrier for adoption for a lot of producers. There's aggregators in the space. I'm not talking about you guys, but there's aggregators in the space that try to ignore additionality and just want to measure your accrual over time. Yet in the background, if you're not doing quote unquote AMP grazing, you're not getting a contract from them. And so that they're hedging their bet a little bit. And that's a whole nother conversation. But number one, do you guys have put any restrictions on practices for producers that are willing to participate in this? And I think we can all agree that a change in grazing management can provide a lot of positive ecological returns. But how are you positioning yourselves as a business to safeguard the producer and yourself as a business to quantify a small tweak in grazing management is actually going to produce the carbon accrual that you're estimating? What tools are you using to estimate it, and how are you positioning yourselves to mitigate that risk?
Our estimation tools are backed by large data sets from peer-reviewed literature. That's how we are estimating these. That being said, we are not overestimating. So if we go sit down with a rancher, we're not going to tell somebody in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming that they're going to get 2 tons per year if they start shrinking their cattle into, a 10,000 meter square pasture and moving them every 24 hours. That's ridiculous. It's too dry. We're not just hoping we want the ecological services, but there's also science backed by this. And we've looked at temporal regimes. When we stratify, we're looking at that when we go out and sample, And so we're not just doing this willy-nilly by any means. And when we do make these estimates, we are very upfront. And we have told some producers, you're just way, way, way too arid. Like, you're going to be upset at the end of our contract, and we're going to be rather sad because we're here to store carbon and to sell that credit. And we're taking a risk through paying for the soil sampling, paying for the verification, signing up, having our agronomists out there, having our science team model and stratify and do all this stuff. We're losing money on you because it's just not going to work. Nothing because you can't implement it, but everything else that we can't control is making this a poor option for us.
So we have a couple of different ways that we go about this. We do have a peer-reviewed model that we use. We consider it to be conservative, but again, as I said, we adjust that with soil sampling. We also collect baseline grazing. We do an average over what is your average grazing management over the past 3 years. Before we contract, we do a 5-year plan. Where do you want to be at the end of 5 years? What's your plans? I go pasture by, sometimes it takes me 6 hours, sit down with a rancher and go pasture by pasture. How many splits do you want to do? What infrastructure needs and plans do you want to do? How much do you think it's going to cost? Because we provide upfront funding for infrastructure. We also collect grazing records every year, and we go and look at them and go, hey, what do you need? You're not meeting the goal you set for yourself. I didn't set it for you. And what are you doing to do that? With additionality, it's in our PDD. We can justify it as we're helping you speed up and catalyze that change. Grazing, it's much more of a spectrum. Cover crop, and it's a little bit more black and white. We were looking at a cotton project, and I went down to Georgia, and everyone had been cover cropping for 20 years. And I pointed the Sustainable Cotton Initiative guy and told him to sign up with him because it's not a good fit. And you guys, I told them the things they should watch out for with carbon credits. So that's kind of how we're handling it. We do additionality ranch by ranch and the project as a whole. So we are very concerned about proving that out. So, we would love to see uniform utilization and not overgrazing. That's it's very broad, but that's going to look different for different folks in different contexts. So.
Just my perspective on it is, and I always tell the ranchers, don't tell Native I said this, but we're not doing this for the carbon credits. We're doing this to improve your grazing management, increase your production, increase your soil health, enhance biodiversity, availability to water. All of those things are going to make your ranch more resilient and profitable for your kids and their kids. And so as a closing comment by me, and this kind of gets back to the ethics of everything. Is taking tax dollars from the middle class and giving them to people through a government program better is, and I'll just pick on World Wildlife Fund really quick because they're friends of mine and I've seen their money invested really well, but that came from Cargill and McDonald's and Walmart. That was public. Everybody knew that. Who's to say that's not dirty money and that you shouldn't accept that either? So I think it's important that people understand where the money came from, but regardless of where it came from, if you can use it to improve your rangeland ecosystem and take advantage of those ecosystem services over time, I think that's a smart thing to do. You want to know where the money came from and don't take it if you don't believe in it. But if you can take somebody's money and put it to good use to enhance the environment and make it a better place for your kids and their kids, why would you not do that?
We're coming up on lunch, and we're gonna have to wrap this thing up. I want to leave the panel the last word in just one or maybe two sentences. What's the first thing a person needs to do if they're thinking about going this direction? What's the first thing they need to read, who to talk to?
Well, I would say you guys can speak more to the carbon market side of things. I'll speak to the rancher kitchen table side of things. Is find someone that you trust, that you see as an innovator, a leader, someone who's succeeded, someone who's made mistakes that you don't need to repeat, and go visit their ranch. We've got some ranches in Montana that are putting on their own workshops now. Find examples of success and become that. Go learn from someone else's experience and then put it into your context, because context is key. You won't be able to do exactly what they did, but you can learn from them. And then the other part of it is you've got to commit to a grazing plan. I know it takes time, and I know that you are very busy, but you've got to get this down on paper, and you've got to make a plan for 5 years out and 15 years out and 30 years out of what you can accomplish with your grazing, because it will pay.
Yeah, so I would see, who's in your area as far as that, we're only in Montana and parts of Wyoming, because Vera is much more of a regionally focused segment because context matters and landscapes as well as management. Look for proponents of it and look for people who are anti-carbon market and kind of take what you think fits with you and leave some behind. I mean, same thing with any consultant or any range setup, or any education class we go to. If you want some groups that are real skeptical, National Sustainable Ag Coalition, I used to serve on their climate subcommittee. I used to work in technical assistance for a Farm Bill funded nonprofit for about 4 years. IATP, International Ag Trade Policy Group, is a very skeptical group. So I don't think they ever did publishing. They had a great list of questions that I gave them feedback on a long time ago. I wish they had published, but if Ben Willison is still there, reach out to him. He is very skeptical and will give you good questions. And then, see who in your community is doing it and try to talk to them. I'm a big advocate of peer-to-peer learning. One reason I stopped working technical assistance, I stopped farming and ranching. I kind of felt like a hack. So I moved on, and I also saw people need money, and I got real frustrated with not people wanting to do good work and not being able to access capital and have that infrastructure they needed. Find people in your community and then talk to everyone and ask questions and reevaluate, and look for outside feedback, but look for feedback within yourself and your family too.
The take home from everything both of these guys said, was educate yourself. And that is key, whether you talk to industry people, talk to your neighbor. Don't forget university advisors, don't forget NRCS, don't forget the people you trust, FSA, because they do have knowledge. And if they don't have the knowledge you want, they will point you in the right direction, and it is vital. Be very skeptical. That's the key. And ask the right questions, because no question is dumb. The question that isn't asked is poor. Remember that.
Thank you. So I just want to summarize from our first panel and this one. It sounds like if you're leaning this direction, educate yourself, start with innovative peers who fit within your context. I heard an unexpected response of remain skeptical throughout the whole process. That's good to hear from this panel. And one of the other things that really stuck out to me is bringing legal counsel as soon as before you think you're ready for it. I think that's some good nutshelling on the last hour and a half, 2 hours of talking. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank all the panel speakers. Good Grazing makes sense. Check it out. It's definitely worth your time for more things like this to come. Thank you very much.